Okay, good evening and ברוכים הבאים. We're very pleased to have Professor Pollack from Washington State University in Seattle here to give us a fascinating talk on the fourth property of water, the fourth stage of water. And he is invited from Yon Alexander Bronstein, who is a founding professor of the Ben-Gurion Entrepreneur course for engineers and computer science department, and Professor Shlomi Dolev, who is a founding member of the computer science department in BGU NHSA computer science department. I just repeated myself, I apologize. ברוכים הבאים, אנחנו מאוד נשמח לכבוד את פרופסור פולק מאוניברסיטת של וושינגטון מסיאטל. הוא בא היום לדבר איתנו על הרמה הרביעי של מים. הוא חבר טוב של יונה אלכסנדר ברונשטיין, חבר מסמך של אוניברסיטת בן גוריון על הקורס יזמות שהוא מלמד לסטודנטים להנדסה ומידע המחשב, ופרופסור שלומי דולב שהוא היה הראש הראשון של מחלקת למידע המחשב באוניברסיטת בן גוריון. תודה רבה לכולם. קודם כל יהיה לנו את ההצגה של פרופסור פולק של 60 דקות, שעה שלמה, ואחר כך יהיה אפשרות לשאול שאלות ולקבל תשובות. רק אחר כך, לא בין ההצגה עצמו. Thank you very much for joining us, everyone. At the moment, we're going to have a 60-minute presentation from Professor Pollack, and afterwards we'll have a Q&A of about 15 minutes. Only afterwards, please, no questions during the talk. Professor Pollack, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Well, I'm thrilled about having the opportunity to present to you. And also, by the way, it's not Washington State University, which is a different university. It's the University of Washington in Seattle.
I deeply apologize.
No, it's okay. The mistake is made by many. So there are so many universities with the name Washington that it's totally confusing. I kind of wish that we would change the name, but it's okay. So shall I begin or?
Absolutely, the stage is yours.
Oh, thank you so much. Okay, so I want to talk about a phase of water about which you probably have not heard. And I want to focus on some of the technologies eventually that come from the discoveries that we made, especially getting electrical energy from water, and also water as a information storage mechanism. I know this sounds strange to you, but that's what I want to talk about. And I want to talk also, this is a preview about light. You never think about the idea of light influencing water, but this is actually central to what I want to present. And the first question is, do we really understand everything there is to know about water? You'd think, especially in Israel, where water is so critical, you'd think that everything that could be known about water is known. And I want to start the talk by demonstrating to you that that is not the case. And I'm going to present to you a few illustrations, and I would challenge you to understand the observation. And if you can't understand the observation, I would challenge you, I would suggest that you don't really know everything that there is to know about water. So the first is simple. Here is the Mediterranean, and sometimes you will see an isolated cloud. And as you know, the cloud is made of water. And the question is, why do the clouds float? If you were to take a ladder and extend the ladder with a pitcher of water and turn the pitcher, the water would come right down like a waterfall, but the cloud doesn't. So what keeps it up? And if you don't know the answer, then perhaps you don't know everything there is to know about water. Here's another observation that would challenge you. These are two beakers. Each one is filled with water. And you place one electrode here and one electrode here in the other beaker and turn on the high voltage. And this is what happens. So you get a bridge between the two. And if you use a motor to move one beaker away from the other beaker, the bridge sustains itself. And it can sustain itself for up to a distance of 3 or 4 centimeters and essentially indefinitely. So what's going on? You've never seen, I think, unless you've seen the slides, you've never seen water do this. And can you explain it? And if you can't explain it, then you really don't know all there is to know about water. This is a lizard from Central America. This is, by the way, is from National Geographic. It sits on a limb, and when it gets the inspiration, this is what happens. It jumps off, and it walks on the water. And that's why it's often called the Jesus Christ lizard. How does it walk on the water, you know? And if you don't know the answer, again, well, you don't know everything there is to know about water. And finally, here's another one. And this one is, I think, relevant to the Middle East. And it was a demonstration by a professor at University of Tokyo. This is a superconducting magnet, and this is water. This is a trough filled with water. And to the water is added a little bit of red dye. The reason will be obvious in a moment. So you turn on the magnet, and the Red Sea splits so that Moses could walk across. So I like this demonstration, and I see a few smiles in the audience. But how do you explain it? This is the challenge. You know, it's not so easy to, but it's real. This is absolutely real. Okay, so we start from zero. We don't really understand. For me, the inspiration came from a guy named Gilbert Ling, and Gilbert Ling passed just recently, approaching his 100th birthday. And Gilbert came from China. He was selected among right after World War II as the first cohort to come from China to the U.S. And they chose 3 from all of China, and a physicist, chemist, biologist. And Gilbert was the biologist, and the physicist Yang went on to win a Nobel Prize, and they all thought that Gilbert was the cleverest of the 3. And by the time I met Gilbert at a conference more than 20 years ago, I had been in a different field, field of muscle contraction, and I had known about Gilbert, and I met him and listened to his ideas and listened to people at the same conference where I met him who had evidence to support his view. And his view had to do with water. And, you know, we all know the 3 phases of water, the solid, liquid, and vapor. And Gilbert said, in biology, the water is different. What happens inside your cells and my cells is that the water molecules are lined up, you know, like soldiers at attention. And I found this really interesting. And so I went on after meeting him and showing one of his books to my students, because I was so impressed, but I wondered whether I was just being naive, and because every biologist knew at the time that the water inside the cell was no different from the water in my cup. So they all said, oh, this guy is onto something important, but his books are not so easily digested. And so I took it upon myself to write a book about water. It's called Cells, Gels, and the Engines of Life, and it was published almost 20 years ago. And we then went on to do experiments to explore, and that's what I'm going to be telling you about. But in order to do these experiments, we looked for clues on, you know, how exactly do we study this? And being biologically oriented, although trained in engineering, bioengineering, we knew that Gilbert's ideas meant that the water, the molecules are shown here as dipoles, you know, dipoles sitting next to a surface. And Gilbert said that these dipoles are actually ordered in some way, as I mentioned, like soldiers at attention. Of course, when you get far enough away from the surface that's involved in ordering these dipoles, because of thermal motion, Brownian motion, you get randomness. And chemists will admit to perhaps one or two layers of this kind of water. But Gilbert said, oh no, it's dozens, if not hundreds. And I'm going to show you that it's even more than that, uh, of molecules that are ordered. And so it's kind of like a crystal, this kind of ordering. And so we began looking for something that had a kind of a properties of crystalline nature, and that is that the crystals exclude impurities. So like ice, when ice forms, you get a pure crystal. And that means that all of the particles, molecules, whatever that had originally been inside the crystal get excluded. So we're looking for some kind of exclusion. And we found it actually rather quickly. So what you see here represents a chamber. And in the chamber, we put a gel. And then we added water that you see here. And we also put particles in the water. So we got a suspension of these little spheres called microspheres. They're common. And we noticed looking in the microscope right away that we could see a zone over here, roughly 10 micrometers in size, where the particles were excluded. And we thought, maybe, just maybe, the region of water here is actually this kind of crystalline or structured water that would tend to exclude these particles. And you can see it more readily in a video. This is actually one of the first videos we took. And so you have a region here that grows over time. This is about a 5-minute time span. And as it grows, it pushes out these spheres. So we began seeing this again and again. Someone suggested, well, instead of having to describe it every time you talk about it, why don't you give it a name? And so we called it, on the basis of a suggestion by an Australian colleague, exclusion zone. And it works because it excludes. It doesn't tell you much about what's going on here, but it works very well for those of us in the US, because exclusion zone is EZ. You might say EZ, it doesn't work, but it's easy for us to remember, and so we adopt this title, this EZ. And we found very soon that many substances put here, it doesn't need to be a gel, all kinds of polymers and biological surfaces will create something similar to this. So in terms of generality, we found that many hydrophilic, that is water-loving surfaces, of which most surfaces are, will generate these exclusion zones, and many solutes are excluded. I just don't want to take the time to go through and show you many pictures. Now, the second point is, okay, so you can see these exclusion zones rather commonly, but is the water inside these zones really different from ordinary water or not? We did many experiments, as did others, and I just want to give you a sample listing of the evidence that the EZ water really is physically different from bulk water. And most of this stuff is published, mostly almost a decade ago, and by now we can add probably a half dozen additional pieces of evidence. And I don't want to go through these because I'll use up my 60 minutes easily on the first 3 or 4, but you can sort of glance through, I think, without my having to go. These are some of the properties that we've found that are not properties of ordinary water, high viscosities, aligned molecules. And these are the methods that we use, some of which may not be so familiar to you, but anyway, it's possible if anybody has a deeper interest to check the papers. I do want to talk about one of these, about electrical charge, because it's really important and in fact central to so much of what I want to say. Ordinary water doesn't have charge, it's neutral, but we found that the EZ has negative charge, and we found that by sticking electrodes in, very tiny electrodes, and finding that, and so we have a situation that we wind up with, again skipping the details of the experiment for time timing reasons, you have a surface here sitting next to water. This is a hydrophilic, water-loving kind of surface. You know, a surface where if you put a droplet of water, it spreads out, unlike Teflon, hydrophobic, where it beads up. So we found that this easy region typically has negative charge, and the region beyond has positive charge. So this is a battery from which, as I'll show you later, you can get electrical energy from water. Now, how does this happen? Well, it happens because we're starting with water, right? Remember, next to this hydrophilic surface, we dump water, and this zone actually builds. And so how does it build? So it starts from water molecules. And you may recall that water molecules look something like this, with an oxygen, 2 hydrogens, and energy comes in, and we'll talk about the energy in a moment. And that energy splits the water into positive part and net negative part. So this is a dipole with a net negative charge. And these dipoles begin lining up next to the hydrophilic surface and building this layered structure, which, because of the negatively charged entity here, has a net negative charge. And the positives get excluded from this region and wind up out here. So you wind up with the battery. We found that the structure of this zone is not actually the dipoles that are lined up, as Gilbert Ling had suggested, because dipoles, real dipoles, are neutral, and this is not neutral. This is net negative in charge. And we found that the structure looks like this, again, without going into the details. So here is the hydrophilic material sitting next to water, and out of this water build these easy layers, one at a time. And the easy layers have a hexagonal structure to them, which is very common in nature. They're built of hydrogens and oxygens, and they build one at a time, just like that, out of this water. So it's actually a chemical change that occurs. And if you were to look at the surface of any one of these layers, it would look something like this. So you'd see the oxygen here in red, and the hydrogens in between, making up this honeycomb or hexagonal motif. So if you then count the number of hydrogens and oxygens here, it turns out it's not H2O. And that makes total sense because H2O is neutral and this is negatively charged. And so the actual chemical formula, if you will, of one of these is H3O2. Now, H4O2 would be double this one, and it's neutral. H3O2 is minus a positive charge, and so it does have a net negative charge. So we think that from all the evidence we've seen that this is the real structure of this exclusion zone. And sometimes we refer to this as the fourth phase of water or easy water, and I use these terms interchangeably. Now inside the cell, and I know that some of you may be interested, but others, computer science, may be less interested, but this is your body. So I think we should all be interested to some extent. And inside the cell is filled with solids that contain hydrophilic surfaces, and just the kind of surfaces that would tend to create the easy water, the negatively charged easy water. And so I've drawn it here. I've drawn all these negative charges inside the cell. And anybody who's a biologist probably knows that all cells have a net negative charge. And the usual explanation is something to do with the membrane, pumps, and channels. And in my various books and papers, I've challenged that point of view. And I think the negative charge comes from the water that's inside the cell, the easy water that contains negative charge. The cell is actually extremely crowded with solids. And so there's not much water inside the cell by volume, maybe a surface to surface distance equal to the size of 7 water molecules. It's really packed inside. And that's the reason for the negative charge. But I digress. I want to now address the question of whether easy water could contain memory or information. And I know how weird that must sound to anybody who is outside the field. But you know, think about the flash drive that we all use. and think about what's inside and how it works. And many of you I know are experts, and I'm not. But there are a couple of characteristics of this that actually are shared by easy water. Uh, the first is that inside the silicon-based transistors uh, uh, are ordered not only in 2 dimensions but 3 dimensions. And as we know, these transistors can take on one of 2 states: 0, 1, on, off, and so the 2 characteristics, the main characteristics, are order and the capacity to occupy either of 2 states. And that's how my understanding of how the memory works. And so look at the EZ structure. There is some similarity to that in that we have order to begin with. These are packed in an orderly fashion in 3 dimensions. And the question is, gee, it's interesting, just like the transistors are ordered, but is it possible that either the hydrogen or the oxygen can occupy 2 states? I've heard nothing about the hydrogen atom occupying 2 states, but it turns out that the oxygen occupies not 2 states, but 5 different oxidation states. -2, -1, the -2 we know about, usually we call it valence, -2, -1, 0, and also +1 and +2. And this is not a radical idea. You can find this in any standard chemistry textbook. So not only is the oxygen able to take on 2 states, but 5 states. And if you do the computation, it's simple. I forgot the exact value, but the information density, if this could store information, the information density would be something like, I think it was 100 million times the information density that now exists in your flash drive. So there's a lot of promise to this, but there are many questions about how to realize the input and output. But you might ask, well, gee, it's a fine theoretical idea, but is there really any evidence for any kind of information storage in water? And the guy who is most famous for this is the late Jacques Benveniste, who was a friend of mine. And he was a famous immunologist. And someone came to his laboratory saying that, it's possible that water can contain information. And I don't have enough time to go into it, but Jacques was a bold fellow, and he tried to publish in Nature, and they ridiculed him. And they put together a commission of inspectors to go to visit his laboratory and see what he was doing. And they concluded, the editors, including the editor of Nature, they concluded that this guy is a charlatan. His work has since been confirmed by many groups throughout the world. So there's no question he was not a charlatan, but he was ridiculed. And that at the time, the idea of water memory, and he admits that this was not a good term to use because it inspired a lot of flack. So he became a scientific joke. And the joke was, oh, you're getting old, having trouble remembering, drink some of Jacques Benveniste water because, it has memory, it will help you restore it. So a lot of people, scientists, stayed away from studying water because, as an example, if people like that could be ridiculed, and others might be subject to the same fate. Perhaps the most famous person of all who was involved with information imparted into water is the late Masaru Emoto, who died about 5 years ago. And he demonstrated that if you put intention into water, just sitting there and thinking about it, it could influence ice crystal shape. So his experiment, he took a petri dish, filled it with water, and either focused his intention on the water or played some music to the water or a number of things. And then he'd freeze the water and look in the microscope and look at the water, the crystals that formed. And if you take Tokyo tap water and do that, this is what the crystal looks like. It's really ugly. On the other hand, after prayer or after a number of other influences, this is representative of the kind of crystal that forms. And of course, among scientists, this didn't hold any water, so to speak, because he had a tendency to take these crystals and show the ones that best illustrated the point that he was trying to make. And he claimed that he was a spiritualist, not a scientist. And people now who have taken over, led by his son and a group of conscientious, thoughtful people, have begun to do these experiments more scientifically. But back in the days, this is a typical example. So you play a Mozart symphony to the water, or John Lennon, Imagine, or think about peace or thank you, and you get crystals that look like this. On the other hand, You Fool, or playing heavy metal music gave crystals like this. So other people have now taken up this and are approaching it in a more scientific way. And it's presented at our annual conference. So we organize the annual conference on the physics, chemistry, and biology of water. Any of you who are interested are welcome. The next one is this spring, we hope. And many people come, and of the people who come, we will have each year 2 or 3 or 4 presentations that deal with information in water, memory of water. And perhaps the most distinguished of all is, who comes each year and will be coming next April, is Luc Montagnier. And Luc won the Nobel Prize for discovering HIV. He was a friend of Jacques Benveniste. And when Jacques passed, he said, I got to get into this. And now he spends his time dealing with information in water. And each year, people are eager to hear what he wants to say next. Even he demonstrated in a beautiful experiment, now confirmed by a couple of other groups, that information from DNA can actually be transmitted to water without any chemical contact whatsoever. Some kind of information is getting transmitted. And we think it probably lies in the EZ water that's structured. And finally, a point of relevance for this is that the EZ water, which has a high viscosity, it's sort of like honey, but it was found that the EZ water can be solidified, a real solid, at room temperature. And this was discovered a few years ago by Vittorio Elia in Italy. And here's what he found. This little powder here sitting at the bottom of the vial is EZ water that he collected, or he and his wife mostly did most of the work, collected, and collecting this much will take many weeks, if not months. It's a real challenge to collect it. And recently we've confirmed it, confirmed and extended his work. And here you can see at the bottom of the vial, this is EZ water. And you can take this powder, which is sitting indefinitely, add it to water. And if you do that, you find all the EZ properties that we and others have found earlier. So it means that in the future, if it's really possible to understand in detail how the EZ water, how you can get information in and out, it's possible that this will be filled with solid EZ water in the future. Okay, so back to the original question. Is EZ water really physically distinct from bulk water? And the answer is yes. I've listed and shown you a bit of the evidence, a layered honeycomb structure with information storage capability. Now, I also mentioned that this was a battery, and all batteries need charge. So if you take your cell phone and forget to plug it in, it won't work. And so what charges this battery that we're talking about? Well, it turns out we couldn't figure it out. I must admit, we were scratching our collective heads for a while, and an undergraduate student doing an experiment that he wasn't supposed to do, but these guys have chutzpah. They want to do, they're curious. So the idea, he found that the energy came from light. How did he find out? Well, this is actually one of his observations. Of course, this is not, but so we had a hydrophilic material sitting in a chamber, and the material that we were using in this case is Naphion. It's a polymer that's very hydrophilic, and we use it often, although not exclusively. And it was sitting next to water and microspheres, the same as I indicated. So here's the exclusion zone, and here are the microspheres. And usually the exclusion zone, the boundary here between the exclusion zone and the ordinary water with microspheres is straight. It would be parallel to this surface. So the student called me in, and he had grabbed a lamp from sitting right next to where he was and shined it on. And this is what he showed me. And I said to him, wow, because the exclusion zone could expand enormously. So I said to him, well, take it away and see what happens. And sure enough, with a time constant of a few tens of minutes, it receded back to this straight line. And so it was reversible. And as I like to say, it didn't take a rocket scientist to figure out if light is building this, then the energy, the photons are responsible for the energy that is necessary for creating this exclusion zone and the charge separation that goes with it, the battery-like feature. We did studies using series of wavelengths to figure out which ones are most powerful. And the wavelengths we studied range from the UV through the visible, through the infrared. And we found that the most effective is in the infrared. So you can't see it, but it's there. And a lot of people are confused by infrared. They think, oh yeah, if you look at the toaster and look at those coils, the coils are generating a heat and infrared, and people take infrared and heat as virtually synonymous, and they are similar, although there are some distinctions. And so we found that infrared is the most powerful, and the infrared energy is actually all over the place. It's virtually impossible to get rid of it, even under extreme conditions. Everything is generating infrared. And if you were to darken your room and see nothing and whip out your cell phone camera, which also sees no image, but if you had a camera with an infrared sensor instead of a visible light sensor, you get a perfect image of everything, including you and the room that you're sitting in and the watch that you're wearing, et cetera, et cetera. So it's all over the place. It comes from everywhere, not just your toaster. And therefore, because it's abundant and present all over, it means that if you got water sitting next to a hydrophilic material, since that energy is always there, you always have some easy water, okay, in this situation. Not just inside your body, but outside your body and all over. And if you were to add more infrared energy, the EZ would build. And we've experimentally seen it build by 10 times easily from a very weak LED, giving rise to infrared light at 3 micrometer wavelength. And if you were to remove that extra, you go back to the default here. Okay. So in terms of energy for buildup of EZ, it's powered by light, photonic energy, which orders the water. You need energy to do that. And it charges the water battery. You need energy to do that. So that's the energetic system. And it's actually very straightforward, even in Tel Aviv. You just lie on the beach, you know, and you absorb the sunshine. And the sunshine, by the way, more than 50% of the energy coming out is infrared energy, and you get charged up. It's as simple as that. Now, if that's true, you'd say, my goodness, just lying in the sun gets you all charged up. You ought to be able to exploit that energy that you're getting, right? And so question arises, well, can you actually harvest this kind of energy? And probably you say, well, no, because I don't think any of you has ever seen a glass of water doing work, right? Well, I'm going to show you an example of water doing work, okay? And it actually comes again from a student. We found out that this material called Naphion, which we like to use a lot, comes in the form of tubes. open tubes like a straw. And I asked one of the undergraduate students to look and see if you put this in water, does it generate an exclusion zone? We know that the flat sheets of Nafion do it, but the question is, can these tubes do it as well? We expected one outside and also inside. And the answer came back very quickly, and the answer was yes. But of course, the student was curious, and like the student with the lamp sitting next to him, he wanted to see more. And so he put microspheres in the water, and the microspheres allowed him to use a microscope sitting down here and looking upward to see what's going on here. And one day, a few weeks after he began, he came barging into my office. And usually the students are polite, they'll either knock at the door, or usually the door's open, they peek their head in and say, do you have a moment, or something like that? And I encourage that. And this guy doesn't do anything. He just barges into the room. And I remember distinctly, because I had a visitor sitting in the office. I can't remember who it was or what we're talking about, but the guy barges in, interrupts us, and he says, I saw something really important. I think it's important, and I had to tell you. So, okay, tell me. So what's so important? He said, I'm watching this, and I see the water coming through the tube, and it never stops. And I'm thinking, my goodness, this is much more interesting than the visitor I'm talking to. I said, I said to myself, if this is true, this is really, really important, because, usually if you have a tube and you want to drive fluid through the tube, you need energy to do that. And typically it comes from pressure. So you've got a pressure gradient from here to here, and the pressure gradient drives the flow, but there's no pressure gradient because it's sitting horizontally, and the pressure here and the pressure here are the same. So it doesn't, that's not the answer. And we had discovered, as I showed you, that energy that's coming in is absorbed by the water and creates exclusion zones. So we started wondering, and we checked to see that his work was correct. And indeed, it turned out to be very important. And I'll show you an application in a moment. But here's a tube. You fill it with water, make sure there are no air bubbles. And then stick it into the chamber with microspheres and water. Go to the microscope, reduce the light, just use green light, and look in the microscope, and this is what you find. So here's the Nafion tube, the exclusion zone, and the water goes through. And we've had it going for a day and a half, and we know how to make it go for even longer than that. Essentially, it's indefinite. So our critics came and said, well, this is pretty interesting. However, it might be due to some peculiar exotic feature of Nafion. Why don't you use other tubes? Well, we couldn't find other tubes, so we essentially made tubes of our own. And the way we made these tubes, or tunnels, if you will, is we took a gel, and the gel is first in its liquid state. And as it's beginning to gel, that is the student, put a wire in, and as it was gelling, we pulled the wire out. So you have a block of gel with a tunnel inside, an open tunnel. You take the block of gel with the open tunnel and stick it into water plus microspheres. And this is what you see. So this one is a polyacrylic acid gel. You can see the gel is here and here. And here's the tunnel. And within a few minutes, the exclusion zone grows. It grows from here, as you'd expect, pushing all the microspheres to the center. And if you then look, whoops, the video, you can see the same. We tried this in at least a half dozen different gels, and you get the same effect. And so this is nothing specific to Nafion, it's general. And it's always associated with exclusion zones, creating positive charge here, negative charge here. And these positive charges want to get out, and they'll go either this way or this way. And once they start going, the water leaves, more water gets sucked in, and it's perpetuated. So the next question that came to us from critics, oh, you think all of this is powered by light, which builds the EZ? why don't you just crank up the microscope illumination and see if it goes faster? We did that a few years ago. We published it. We could get a 5 times increase in speed just by turning up the lamp. So to summarize, we've got a hollow tube sitting in water, and the flow goes right through it. Work is done. And so in order for work to be done, you need energy. And the only energy that we could imagine, and maybe you can imagine a different one, besides the pressure kind of approach when there's no pressure gradient here, is the absorption of light energy. A necessary condition is that energy. And so the water is actually then a transducer of light energy into mechanical energy. And we've seen other kinds of transduction. So the water can actually transduce light energy into mechanical energy. Now, a question arises, what about you and me? Do we use radiant energy, or do we use light energy? Of course, you know that plants do that. Do we do that? So think about Mother Nature in her great wisdom. Mother Nature invented, shall we say, plants, green plants, and they use light energy. And some single-celled organisms, some bacteria also use light energy. They all photosynthesize. And by the way, the first step of photosynthesis is the breaking of water molecules into plus and minus. Interesting. So Mother Nature now is about to create animals. And she knows that animals can get their sustenance by foraging. But she has a question. She has to make a decision on all this stuff. Do I abandon light energy in animals? Because, you know, foraging is easy. You can get your food in that way. Or do I keep it maybe in reserve and use it when necessary? And this is an important question because it may apply to you. And so Mother Nature, in her wisdom, at least if I were Mother Nature, what I would do is keep it, and maybe in reserve, so to speak, or something. And so we receive energy all the time from outside, including infrared energy from the sun, and some wavelengths penetrate our body, our clothing, or whatever. And the question is, do we use it? And one idea about use comes from maybe in the cardiovascular system. So the capillaries are very close to the surface. And the question is whether the light that penetrates can help drive flow in the capillaries the way it drives flow in the tubes in the laboratory. And we didn't pursue that at first, but I went to visit my friend Vladimir Vyakov at Moscow University, and he introduced me to his colleague. And the colleague started telling me that there's a big problem in the cardiovascular system. And I kind of went in with a sense of maybe a little bit of arrogance, because in my graduate student days, I did computer modeling, analog computer, actually, of the cardiovascular system, of the pressures and flows. And I thought we had it pretty much all worked out. And it took 5 minutes only for me to be convinced that I was wrong. We didn't have it all worked out. And what's the argument? Well, the argument is very simple. It's capillaries in healthy young adults are maybe 3 or 4 micrometers in diameter, but the red blood cells that have to pass through are twice that size, 6 or 7 micrometers. So how on earth do those red blood cells pass through? The energy that's required is enormous. They have to be compressed. The red blood cells have to be compressed, and it requires energy. It's sort of like your toilet. You know, sometimes it gets stopped. You take the plunger and you push, and you got to use a certain amount of energy. So they calculated that it would, if the heart were fully responsible, the heart alone, it would take something like require a ventricular pressure something like 1 million times the actual ventricular pressure. Obviously absurd. So the conclusion, and they convinced me very quickly, the conclusion is the heart alone can't be responsible. And here's a demonstration of such. So the red blood cells look like this, but this is now a muscle tissue. You can see the striations of muscle. And here's a capillary and another capillary and so on. And you can see the red blood cells. Now, to pass through these narrow cells, you can see that they have to be compressed. And the energy required is enormous. And this video shows, you can see this guy is having really a hard time getting through. So where does the extra energy come from if it's not the heart? Well, they had some suggestion, and I'm thinking, well, gee, we've seen this in the laboratory. Maybe it's the same mechanism. Might radiant energy, that is infrared energy coming to you from outside, might that help drive the blood flow in your capillaries? And my conscientious student who was working on the project noticed that there was a paper from Israel, and I'm sorry, I don't have the name of the investigator. Maybe they're there, please introduce yourselves. We're measuring flow in mice and open chest mice. And after their experiments were over, they sacrificed the mouse, and the mouse complied by dying within a few seconds. But they noticed that the flow continued. It didn't stop. At lower velocity, but it kept going. And it kept going for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour. And they repeated this in I think, 10 different experiments. And they concluded that there's got to be something else going on there besides the heart, because the flow continues. Well, it turns out the flow continues. There have been actually a half dozen experiments over the years showing much the same. So something is going on besides the heart. So we did experiments recently completed and now being prepared for publication, my student Li Zheng, and he used a chick embryo, 3-day-old embryo. The nervous system is not well developed, the hormonal system, it's just a pure, pretty much cardiovascular system that's developing. And you can see it here. You can see the various vessels in the heart. And he could then take the fertilized egg, lop off the top of the shell, visualize it in the microscope, and track the flow here or here with a special microscope. And the first experiment is to stop the heart and see if there's still flow. And you could do that. He did it by dropping potassium chloride on the heart. And here's the result. So this is blood flow velocity versus time. And so when he stops the heart, the blood flow diminishes, but it doesn't go to zero. It keeps going in this case. And then he tested to see whether our mechanism is working. And the signature feature is applying infrared energy and see if it goes faster. And this is his result. And you can see that the velocity increased by about 3 times. And then when he turned off the infrared, went back down toward baseline. So we think that in your heart and my heart, or in your and my cardiovascular system, it's not just the heart that's working. The vessels themselves are actually helping to propel the flow. And all of this is run by light, remember, by infrared light. And so I'm not suggesting that we photosynthesize, but I'm suggesting that we use light. Remember, light is the first step in the photosynthetic process. So where do we get our energy? Well, obviously, we can get our energy from food, some of us more than others. And we also get energy from light, which is absorbed by the water, which builds EZ, which fills our cells. It's not ordinary water, it's EZ water that fills our cells, and that gives us energy. So practical implications of all this, well, getting energy from water and sunlight is kind of self-evident, and we have patents for this and for what I'm going to show you in a moment. And we've been working on developing these. And in this case, you stick 2 electrodes in. One electrode is sitting here in the EZ water, negative, and another one here. And if this is really true, you ought to be able to light a light bulb And here's a demonstration that you actually can. So here are, I believe it's a dozen cells containing water, naphthalene, and pairs of electrodes in each case. And this is a switch. And here is a magnifying glass under which is sitting an LED. And so as the video shows, you turn the switch and voila, it lights. So in principle, this works. And we really have interested in making this, turning this into something that's useful for humanity, because I don't need to tell you the because. Getting energy from renewable energy from light and water, I think should be self-evident. Another one is getting drinking water from contaminated water. And as you know, so much of the water that we drink is filled with pharmaceuticals and all kinds of chazarai. You have, the way it works is you've got a tube. It doesn't have to be naphthalene, any of the tubes I've shown you. And you've got input flow into the tubes. And this flow may contain junk, all kinds of junk. And as representative junk, we use those tiny spheres because they're just easy to use. And we've also tried bacteria and viruses and you name it. Okay, so the microspheres get excluded from the surface, and they're then concentrated in the middle, just as I've shown you. So the flow is going through, and we devised a collector given the fancy name of differential extractor. It's nothing more than 2 concentric tubes. And the middle one collects the junk, and it comes here. And the one at the edge collects the exclusion zone, or 4th phase water, which is shown here. This is not actually the best result. It actually is a representative result. We've been able to separate in one single pass a ratio of concentration of 200 to 1 in this. And obviously, crossing the valley of death from what you can do in a laboratory to what is useful outside is a challenge, and we've begun working on that. One objective is to see if we can separate salt from the water, and the idea of getting water from the ocean and getting drinkable water out of that is exciting. You all know about, I think, about reverse osmosis. It does the job, and it does it pretty well, but the energy that's required to make it work is huge. And this requires only energy from the sun. That's all. And in the Middle East, of course, you've got ample sunshine, and there's no physical filter that needs changing periodically. The separation is accomplished by the energy from the sun that creates EZ and separates all the junk. So we're excited about those developments. So I think I'm reaching my time limit, and that works perfectly because I'm getting to the conclusions. The conclusion, I guess the kind of central conclusion is that water has not 3 states or 3 phases, if you will, but 4 phases. And the new, it's not new, but maybe recently discovered, shall we say, phase is EZ water. And I place the EZ water here between the ice and water because the structure of the EZ, the hexagonal structure, is actually not so different from the structure of ice. It's also hexagonal. It's not the same, but it's close. And we found experimentally, I haven't had time to present it, if you want to freeze the water, you cannot go from water to ice. You actually pass through the EZ phase and then to ice. And if you melt the ice, you pass through the EZ phase to get to water. And this helps actually to clarify various paradoxes that have persisted in the field in terms of freezing of water. This resolves them. So 4 phases instead of 3. And what are the implications of that? Well, the central implication is that the energy from the environment is radiant energy, light, especially infrared, but other wavelengths too. This is absorbed by the water and it's used by the water. It's not just re-radiated out, it's actually functionally important. I've given you one example, blood flow. I haven't had time to tell you that our evidence is that every cell in your body is using this kind of energy, not just inside the cardiovascular system. In terms of chemistry, we read a chemistry book. Some of us can understand it more readily than others, but the mechanisms for reactions in water and aqueous solutions, some of them are complicated, but no chemistry book that I know of talks about EZ formation, separation of charge, influence of light, etc. And if what I've told you is correct, or close to being correct, then many of the mechanisms that you read about in the chemistry book will need to change. Weather, well, I don't know about in Israel, but we listen to the weather forecast. In Seattle, we have a lot of rain. I just look outside, especially in the wintertime. And typically in the morning, we don't know whether to take an umbrella, not to take an umbrella, 50% chance of rain. They're improving, but they don't get it right. And I think one of the reasons they don't get it right so often is that they talk only about temperature and pressure, but clouds are full of charge. Of course, you can recognize that under some conditions, but it turns out that all clouds are charged. And so this is important, and I do think that dealing with this in my forthcoming book, that cloud charge is absolutely central in everything that happens in weather. In terms of health, it's really important to feel that your cells be filled with this kind of EZ water, because many of the processes that go on in your cells is a transition. The transition is a trigger, a transition from EZ, fourth phase water, to ordinary water, and then back again. That transition triggers so many processes that go on that are really important in your health. So keeping your cells filled with EZ water, and there are simple expedients that can do that, is critically important. The food we eat, well, it's often microwaved, it's often dehydrated, it's often frozen, and it's helpful to know something about all of these processes. And I think that the fourth phase idea introduces these processes in a way that can be understood. In terms of practical approaches, I mentioned to you filtration, conceptually simple method for filtration. We hope for desalination. We haven't made too much progress along those lines, but we're optimistic. And also getting electricity from water, and of course, not to mention information in water. And so, before I close with one picture, I want to mention an institute that we've developed, and I should start by saying this Institute for Venture Science is not directly related to the science that I talked about. It's related more broadly to all science. And you may recognize that there have been very few scientific revolutions in the past 10, 20, 30 years. Plenty of technological revolutions led to some extent by Israelis. But if you think of a scientific revolution equivalent to, say, the genetic structure or the splitting of the atom or what have you, it's really hard to come up with a realized scientific revolution that's changed our lives in a major way that's occurred in the last 30 or 40 years. And without going into detail, I think it has to do with the system of supporting science, which tends to be very conservative. So we put together this institute, and the institute is intending on funding promising ideas that challenge conventional thinking that's not working. And we want to create scientific revolutions for doing. And we've from more than 200 pre-proposals and fewer full proposals, we've identified 5 exciting projects that, if realized, could change the world. And as you know, science leads to technology, and we've kind of run out of new science. And so out of these 5 projects, and more in the future for sure, we're looking for donors to help support these advances. Okay, and finally, I show a slide of my book, and I show it partly because I like the art that's done by my son, who's a gifted artist, and the book is full of cartoons. And it's become really popular on Amazon, and it discusses in more detail what I've been talking about during this 1 hour. And I think I've ended precisely on time. So I will now open it for questions, and I hope I can answer your questions, but please feel free.
So first of all, thank you very much, Professor Pollack, for getting up early to share your life research with us here in Israel.
Thank you.
Really, really appreciate it. Second, I have heard that you did start a company based on this discovery. Would you say a few words about what your startup is up to and what you've done with it?
Well, yeah, I mean, our startup has been up to. We started with filtration, and we spent a couple of years on the filtration issue, and we ran into some technical obstacles that require substantial investment, and we haven't been able to yet achieve that investment and make it go. And we pivoted to some extent in the direction of creating a kind of water that is rich with EZ. And we've been developing that because this kind of water, we think, will be beneficial for health. I receive queries, so many from people saying, "Hey, which water should I drink?" And my standard answer is, I don't know. And the reason I don't know is because the tests need to be carried out to figure out which water is best for health. And so far, it looks as though, from the evidence that we have, is that if you drink water that's rich in EZ, it should be good for health. And we don't know for sure. It seems that way because it needs to be tested, and getting the money that's required for carrying out independent testing, not done by a company that produces one of the waters, but by a group, is really important. And so because we're pretty confident, although it's not certain, that if you drink water that contains EZ, it's good for health. And one example of that is doing juicing, where you take the leaves of freshly grown plants and you squeeze the water out. And what are you doing? You're squeezing out the water from inside the cells of the plant. And that should be water that's filled with EZ, and we've confirmed that. And various health practitioners have reported that people who are ill, they come, and the first route is drinking this kind of water. And the report is the patients come back a few months later, and whatever it is that is creating problems has improved by drinking. So we've been working on that. And anyway, these have been the kinds of development. And we also looked somewhat into desalination, but we haven't gotten very far. So that's roughly where we are. And I think let me leave it there. There's more to say, but I think there are other questions. So
thank you very much. We have 2 questions already. Shoshana Rappaport asks, you mentioned a forthcoming book. When is it to be expected, and what is the title?
Good question. There's no title yet. And the reason there's no title is I can't decide between 2 or 3 prospective titles. Titles are not so important as they used to be, because people don't usually go to the bookstore to buy them. And the pictures on the cover are not so important either for that reason. But I don't know. The book is almost ready. I've pretty much finished my part, but the problem is finishing the artwork. It's mostly done, but my son, who's the artist, a really gifted artist, is working on it, but his current home renovation is keeping him from making progress. So although it could be published in the next 3 or 4 months, I think it's likely to be closer to 1 year. And it's about the role of charge in nature. And I think electrical charge is central to so many things in nature that we never think about. And I'm really excited about the book. So anyway, that's the answer. I could tell you more about the different topics, but it's slightly digressing. I'll just say one thing about bird flying. Okay, that's one chapter I'm working on right now. And if you were asked, how do birds fly? Your reflexive response would be, oh, they flap their wings. But I look out my window over Lake Washington and the Cascade Mountains, which I can see not today because of the rain. And I look out and there's an eagle's nest in the tree, and I watch the eagles fly every day. And only rarely do they flap their wings. And they actually glide most of the time. And the question is, well, if that's true, then, and there are so many birds that actually glide or soar most of the time. And we reflexively attribute that to updrafts, but we've done experiments to demonstrate that these birds can fly with no obvious updrafts at all. So something beyond flapping of wings is going on. And without going into detail, so those of you who are familiar with the triboelectric effect, anything moving through the air will acquire charge. And I think that charge, again, without detailing it, is responsible for keeping birds up in the air. I'll leave it at that because we don't have too much time in it. And there are at least one more question.
Yeah, we have 2 more questions already. Shlomi, do you want to ask your question first? You have to unmute yourself.
Thank you very much for the exciting talk.
Oh, thank you.
Fascinating to think about science, and you are right. You think about what happened in the 30 years, maybe before that there were quantum effects and some others, but it's about time to have something very new. And this is a big challenge. I just thought about the easy phenomena, but if you look at snow, it's not two-dimensional structure, it's three-dimensional. So I'm saying that maybe you have these molecules, water molecules, not shaped in a plane, but maybe shaped in 3D. So it will be richer even.
Yes, absolutely, and it's possible. It's possible to imagine, as you suggest, this three-dimensional shape growing out of the 2 dimensions. I don't have the ability to describe that here, but in terms of snow, there are certain features of snow that we don't understand. Of course, in Israel, you don't understand it because it never snows. But
right, snow. Right.
Yeah, but one of the reasons why the snowflakes remain independent and don't coalesce is, we think, because they're charged. And actually, the snow is probably a build-up. It's not ice, right? Because it doesn't have the characteristics, but it's not water either. It's somewhere in between. And that in-between structure, we think it has is actually easy. So the snow that's coming on, the flakes are coming on, is easy water with negative charge. And because they all have negative charge, the flakes don't coalesce. They stick together they stay apart from one another. To imagine how the structure could evolve in 3 dimensions, you can imagine in each hexagon, each strut, each line is acting like a door hinge. And it attaches to another hexagon, and those two hexagons are then at an angle from one another. And in that way, you can build three-dimensional structures. So this is an area for the future. I don't claim any vast knowledge about snowfall, but I think this is a clue from which we can begin. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. 1 second. Eliezer Leons asks, could the automotive industry be positively affected?
Could the automotive industry be positively affected? Well, of course, everything could be affected, but maybe could you be more specific?
Professor, wonderful lecture. Thank you so much. And it was just curious to know whether there's enough energy there to be able to push what everybody's trying to do with batteries and lithium and so on. If there's a positive charge to be gained out of what you're doing, maybe it can grow into the transportation industry.
Well, yeah, I actually think it can. I didn't think about very much about automobiles, but yeah, let me speculate. Your question caught me off guard, but I've been thinking actually about that issue, and I think the answer is yes. So you know, sometimes cars going fast enough will lift off the cars that are speeding, and the question is why. And I'm wondering whether as the car goes through the air, it acquires negative charge, and that follows directly from the triboelectric effect. And what many people don't know, and I didn't know until 10 or 15 years ago, is that the Earth also is negatively charged. You know, I started my career studying electrical engineering, and no professor ever told me that the Earth was negatively charged. And when a Russian colleague told me of it, I doubted that it was true. It couldn't be, because no professor ever told me that if you take the plug and stick it into a receptacle, that third prong is sticking into anything but zero or neutral. But when he told me, I was highly skeptical. But then the next day, a student of mine showed me the famous lectures of Richard Feynman, the Nobel laureate, the so-called Einstein of the second half of the last century. And in his lectures, volume 2, chapter 9, is a whole chapter that deals with the negative charge of the Earth and the evidence that's presented. We never learn about that in the US. In Israel, you guys are smarter than we are. Maybe you learn about it, but I don't know if that's the case. But anyway, I came to realize that there was abundant evidence, and it's really important in so many features, including the bird flying, by the way. So yeah, negative charge of the bird repelling the negative charge of the Earth. The same thing could occur in cars. If you get enough charge, the cars there's a tendency for the cars to be repelled somewhat from the Earth. And that in itself might account for the fact that some of these cars actually lift off when they go at really high speeds. The same thing for planes. And so the answer is yes. I think that is absolutely could be true. And another chapter, by the way, in the forthcoming book deals with sailboats. So in Israel, you don't know about this, but in Scandinavia, they have sailboats, ice boats, and they're just like sailboats, but they rest on the ice. So the friction is very low. And these ice boats will head into the apparent wind at directly within 5 degrees or 3 degrees at speeds that exceed 3 times the speed of that wind. This is amazing. So it's like if I were pushing you, you'd move toward me instead of away from me. Totally amazing. And I can't believe that people haven't spoken about it. Well, the sail is also exposed to this triboelectric phenomenon. It moves and it gets charged. And I think it's the charge on the sail that's responsible for pulling the boat ahead. Again, I can't, I don't have the slides and such to demonstrate that. It's coming in the next book. But the answer to your question is absolutely yes. It has it can have a powerful effect on transportation. Thank you for asking that.
Thank you. Thank you for your answer. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, the next question is from Shmuel Makuri. Professor Makuri asks, could you comment on the reception of your results by the physics community?
Well, I guess that's a difficult one to answer because it depends on who in the physics community. But I think I could make it more general. Scientific communities tend to be rather conservative, and as a result of their conservatism, they tend to be reluctant to accept fresh ideas, and many of them wait for their colleagues to accept them, and then they're willing to maybe look into them. So in the physics community, and I put the physics community together with the chemistry community because I think the two are the same. It's mostly a hands-off kind of thing. There is a meeting that occurs annually. It's called it's a Gordon conference that occurs, and it's on water. I think it's every year. Or it might be every 2 years. And my spy from that group comes and tells me that nobody is talking about what I've been talking about. They keep it in reserve, pressing on with their work. Now that's not true by any means of people outside of the academic physics chemistry community. So many people have expressed interest, drawn interest, and built on what we've begun. And so I'd say it's mixed. I'd say that those who are not directly, those whose careers don't depend directly on the structure of water, express interest. Those whose careers are built on the traditional view of water, they express no interest, or some of them, I would say, have been hostile to these ideas. And I got to, and so I got to end that question by saying that I discovered one of the audience participants who was the first one to get me interested in water, and he's there. His name is Reuven Tirosh. I see his name there, but I don't see his picture. And Reuven is a good friend. And Reuven is the first to alert me. We were studying mussels together. And Reuven said, the water has got to be central to the operation of mussel. And I didn't listen as intently as I might have to Reuven's ideas because I wasn't so sure of that, and because I was deeply immersed myself in my own ideas about contraction. And I think that's reflective of the community in general, the physics community and the chemistry community, or some of them, I should say. On the other hand, the area of quantum electrodynamics, Feynman and such, that area has been tied decisively to water structure. And the person who is responsible for that is mainly the late Emilio Del Giudice, who has many, many papers talking about QED, quantum electrodynamics, and water. And I think, it's a different way of looking at the structure and function of water. And I think perhaps it has merit. So I'm sorry, this is a sort of complicated answer to your question, but I hope it kind of summarizes the current state.
Okay, we have time for one last question. Alex, do you want to read Shoshana's question?
Actually, I think Shoshana's question is a very narrow technical question, which I suggest she's actually I suggest she follows up with Professor Pollack by email on the shape of nanostructures. I wanted to end on a more general note. Professor Pollack, if somehow things arrange themselves that you were named as the National Director of Water Research in Israel, what would be your recommendations on where the research community should focus next?
Well, it's funny because the political situation in our country is very unstable, and although making Aliyah has never been on on my list. People here do think that depending on the resolution of the various political issues, that moving to another country is not beyond reason. Your question flatters me. I know it won't happen, but okay. So theoretically, if I were in charge, um, 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 well, I guess I would try to create a fund. If anybody or any group has interest in water, it's got to be the Israelis and also their neighbors. But it's got to be the Israelis. And since I think that water is so central, and not only to technology that can be developed, but also to health. It's absolutely central to every facet of our health. And many people out there, many health practitioners think so. I do podcasts with these people so frequently. They're all interested. They know that water is so central for every aspect of our health. So excuse me, given that background, I would try to set up a fund either by private donors who have done well, just like our Institute for Venture Science, or perhaps by the Israeli government, which maybe, I don't know, is more forward-thinking than our government has been, to set up a fund, a permanent fund for fundamental studies of water. And for those fundamental studies, it would be studies that deal somehow with the structure of water, because that's a topic that's been ignored, and it needs to become a mainstream topic. It hasn't been a mainstream topic, except, as I say, for maybe people associated with our annual conference taking place near Frankfurt, where we have 200 people who are, I think, almost all absolutely convinced of the centrality of all of this. So the fund needs to be set up, and the fund needs to be properly administered by people who really believe in the future of this topic and not politically organized, and long-term funding for people who want to go into it needs to be assured. One of the limitations in any kind of funding like that is if it's on a topic that's not mainstream, people are fearful of immersing themselves in it, because if their experiments, and we're talking fundamental science now, if their experiments don't work out, they may lose their funding, and then who is going to be putting bread on the table? So there has to be some assurance of long-term. And I think that if enough people begin studying this, especially in Israel, I mean, you have the really gifted scientists in Israel. Were to pursue this, the world would change, and the world needs to change. We need to solve the world's problems, and as almost everybody knows, if you have new science, it always leads to new technology that you could never have dreamed of before those scientific discoveries. So in sum, yeah, a fund needs to be set up. It needs to be properly administered. It needs to be directed at fundamental science, not technology, but fundamental science that will lead to technology. And with proper administration, I would predict an explosion of new understanding to benefit the world, which we all want. So anyway, thanks for your question. And maybe given that offer, it would be enough to move to Israel.
Well, we had fewer people in the room than I expected, but including 2 or 3 VCs or people connected to the VC industry who are connected to hire people yet, and God's in the room too. So you never know who is listening. So I want to thank you again very, very much. It's been really a fascinating topic. And I hope your startup does well in one form or another, and that your discoveries end up impacting the energy field and the information field, and that you'll see all that with your own eyes. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank
and,
you very much.
Yeah, thank you, much,
you.
much appreciated.
Thank you very
Okay.
much.
Thanks for the
Thank
opportunity.
you.
Okay,
Thank you.
are we
That's it.
not recording?
End of job.